Hey everyone. Well, I'm sitting here in this chair right now, and I want to discuss something different today. For the last few years, not years, for the last few weeks of on this channel, I've been just doing list videos. Like I've mostly just been showing you my computer and giving you little insights of movies I've seen and rankings of them or whatnot. I haven't really gotten the time recently to just sit down and just talk in my own face and voice. Mainly because a lot of you don't want to hear that. You want to see stuff. Well, me, I figured I might as well mix it up, because that's usually what I like to do. One weekend, I make a top 10 list or something, and the other weekend, I will just sit down and discuss something in my own time. And I haven't really done that in a while, I feel like. So, we're doing it now. Today, I am going to discuss a topic that I find quite interesting for me to discuss. And that is the fact of movies as adaptations. And that's what I like to go with here. For today's video, I am going to be sharing with you my opinion on how adaptations should work. That being that when a movie is released, when it's an adaptation of something like a book, a video game, or even a true story, which is kind of just what every movie is now, I like to wonder when should I really care? Like when it's based on something, when should I try to stick to that? Like when should my criticisms be directed towards the source material of which? Because there are times where a movie will be very unfaithful, yet still have something to enjoy. For example, The Shining is a movie that Stephen King, the author of the original book it was based on, freaking hates to death. He hates that movie because it's so unfaithful to his story. Which is reasonable, mainly since he is the author of his own book, and, makes sense. But what about the viewers of tone? The viewers who read the book but also saw the movie? What do we think about that? Should we criticize the movie for being incredibly unfaithful? Should we take what we love about the book and put that in as something we were hoping to see be good with? Well, here's something I want to talk about. This may be interesting to think about because there are a lot of movies based on books I've seen. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but I'm not really the best reader. Yeah. When it comes to source of media, I can definitely endure all of it, whether it's watching movies, playing video games, maybe playing with some toys, mostly Legos. Reading books is something that isn't really part of my dilemma. Reading books, I'm not saying I hate the idea. I'm just saying it's not an idea that I really can enjoy doing. I mostly kind of have an eyesight thing where when I read a book with small lettering and have to kind of mesmerize the words and what the context is, it doesn't work for me. I mostly just enjoy when it's kind of in shorter terms or in a shorter paragraph. But when it's an entire book of wording, that part I just really cannot do because my eyesight doesn't really work that well with small lettering, a whole paragraph of it. Like, those terms and conditions you always get on the websites or anywhere else? Everyone just clicks accept without reading it. Well, I do too. And it's not just because I don't give a shit about the terms and conditions, even though it is a pretty big reason, but also because it's so smalling and I don't feel like I'll be able to read all of it and remember it in time. That's kind of why I mostly stick to shorter paragraphs and terms, because, or at least have it so that the words are bigger and at least more easily drawn out. So like they're bigger but still readable. That's just how I feel. But let me just stop talking about my eyesight. Let's get into what I was referring to. Meaning there aren't a lot of movies based on books I've seen I actually haven't seen the books of. But I will bring up the movies based on books I have read. Most notably, The Lord of the Rings. That is my favorite book adaptation ever. I mean, it is amazing. Lord of the Rings movies, how do they change in terms of the books? Not sort of. They actually do not change as much as necessary. There are, I think the best changes you can get from these movies are sort of little insights, like there's one bits of something that you remember different from the book, but you have to be a real book nerd from the source, which I not, to really catch that detail and be so remembering of it, which I'm not really towards. But I have looked at the book and the movies and seem to notice a lot of differences. That said, does that ruin the movie for me? Well, let me go ahead and explain something right now. From my personal viewing of opinion, I think that the only way we should judge a movie from what it's adapting is if it's adapting a source of digital media. What I mean by that? How is that supposed to make sense? Well, here's the thing. I'm saying movies, if a movie's based on a book or a toy or something that's per physical or, a physical source of media, like something that you can own, can look at in a sense of paper or real life construction, like Legos, like I said, when you're adapting from that, I personally think that's when you're allowed to do whatever. And not to the point where you can just completely change it, but like you still make it the same idea, but changes I personally think are necessary. I personally think the only time when a movie shouldn't worry about following its source material, when it should just take the idea and think of its own movie for it, is when it's based on something of the platform. When it's something that is when it's a source of media that's kind of more physical and old timey. Considering that those things, they definitely have harder ideas to work as a full movie, and that's kind of what the thing is. So when like you're adapting a book, I think it's perfectly cool to just change as much as you feel like it, but still making it a good movie that's not too confusing or hard to explain. Like still make sure the movie you're writing actually makes sense and doesn't turn out so shitty. But in terms of adapting from the book, you don't really have to worry too much about being faithful. You just gotta worry about knowing what the book's idea was and seeing if you can work in a good idea for a movie, an idea that makes sense and at least doesn't care too much about being faithful and at least can understand more of what you're doing, of like how the movie can make sense. Now, I'm saying only time you should be faithful to something is if it's something that's of the source of digital media. I mean by that is if the movie's based on a TV show or a video game or even a true story. I know true stories don't count in that, but I'll count the true stories also count in that idea. When you're basing it off of those three things, that is when I think you really do need to try to be good and faithful. Because even though you might think, oh, but what if there's so much confusion towards it? Well, what I personally think is the only things you really can change when adapting into a movie is changes that either can adjust it so that it works its way as a plot, and changes that fix an issue that we have in the original source material. Like a little fix of an issue that the original I'm not explaining what I'm holding. A original source material that is, there could be problems with it. Not that the source material is bad or awful, but just that there are things about it that you feel deserve to be fixed and worked in if you want to adapt it. As well as making sure the plot that works in as a show for like an episode or whatever can work in as an entire movie. You can make an entire movie, whether it's supposed to serve as a long, extended, climatic episode, or just take rebooting the show and such. So that's what I think is fair. That's where I think adapting is where you need to actually follow. Or video games, for example, because there have been a lot of video game adaptations that really fall under the radar. The first two Mortal Kombat movies released, the one from 1995 and the Annihilation, those movies were paying hard. The newest one from 2021, I guess, got okay reviews, but I mean, What about, I don't know, let's figure some other video game adaptations that everyone despises. Trying to think of easier ones. Like Super Mario Bros. From 1993, that movie bombed hard. Now, many people look back at it and give it a cult following. I guess mostly since those are people that don't care too much about being based from its source material. However, to me, this is just from my opinion source. I really don't care about it not following its source material if the source material is a book or something physical, something that's more in its own world. If it's something that's been popular on TV, then that's where I personally think it does seem kind of wrong to adapt it and just not be faithful to it. I mean, I don't think it's a wrongful doing. I just think that it's would make for a not too enjoyable movie to me. And this is gonna be one opinion I said, but if you remember, I did my list of my 5 favorite and least favorite movies of last year. I said that my least favorite movie of all time last year was Five Nights at Freddy's, and yeah, I'm sure a lot of people didn't agree with that. I mean, not that everyone thinks the movie's amazing, but there have been fans of it. And even those who don't like it don't really consider it that bad to them. But I do because, like I said, it not only does it feel unfaithful, but it kind of portrays what I was supposed to remember from it. Because looking back more, the original games, they had an idea that really could work as a movie. I always thought maybe it could be like a found footage film. You know, like those movies that are filmed on an old camera, like, Paranormal Activity or Blair Witch. That I think could have made for a great movie because with the whole Five Nights at Freddy's movie being about a man sitting in a room with security cameras and having to watch over the animatronics, that I think could have made for a pretty awesome idea. But what we got was silly, ridiculous, had lame setups, and to me just felt really unfaithful for changing its plot too much and not really giving us the main ideas of what the games were for. That's a problem, you know? Or how about TV adaptations? Let's see. Now, TV adaptations can be good, but it really depends on if it's a long, extended episode that has a lot of cinematic stuff, or it's a remake. An extended episode goes for a lot of things. Like, how about some animated stuff, like the SpongeBob movie, the South Park movie, the Simpsons movie? Those 3 movies I really love. They're hilarious as hell, and they do work its way as very big, exciting adventures that can also be like some of an episode of the show that's just a longer runtime. Those are faithful when you portray it as an episode that works in with the series. Maybe like has a adjustment of like a cinematic camera, more cinematic vision to the visuals, as well as a few crazy, more exciting things you wouldn't expect on TV. That kind of stuff. But the rest, works well when you're keeping faithful to what the character's for. That's kind of it, because it's made by the same people who made the show. That's definitely can work as faithful when you're just making a movie that's both an adaptation while also a sequel episode for the series. Remakes, however, those are harder to work for. Now, I have just recently seen the movie Fall Guy, which I don't know how many of you know this, is based on a TV series. And the show is pretty close in comparison with the movie. The movie tweaked a few things, like, of course, the modern setting and a lot of the romantic subplots that went all over the place. But overall, I think those worked out well because it did do its part in paying tribute to the way that stuntmen work. That was kind of a big thing for this idea. Kind of working it as the ideal way of giving stunt performers a good raise, giving them the credit they deserve, because it seems stunt doubles have always been a controversial thing to decide whether you want to give it as much praise as the actors or just leave them on the side. Well, this movie kind of talks about that, kind of shows us how much more fun stunt doubles are. Anyway, yeah, it's faithful because it keeps the same idea and doesn't tweak too much to make it unfaithful, just adds small new aspects. Or how about this, for example? The Last Airbender movie. I know it's a weird movie to bring up immediately, but this is a good example. We all can agree that movie is but garbage, one of the worst films ever. And that's because it's incredibly unfaithful. Now, granted, there are many problems with it, the bad acting, the bad effects, but it's incredibly unfaithful. Mainly because the actors they got for it do not keep in true to what the characters in the show were, and the story ideas that there are, like the way the movie sets up, it just doesn't go in the same form. Like it's a bunch of stuff that's kind of a new term, but doesn't even work in any way as a new thing. You just find it more confusing. That's where the movie blew up hard. That was where everyone realized this movie sucks. Anyway, what I'm saying is, I feel like adapting is kind of a certain thing to do. It can be hard when you see something that's hard to make, but really you can either A, just think of a good way to make it work and just so it can be faithful, or B, if you can't really think of any good way to make it a faithful movie, then just leave it as is. Because honestly, I personally think, unless you're looking at a book or a any other sort of physical home sort of media, you can do whatever you can with it. You can just find ways to make it work in the film. But when you're adapting a TV show or video game, I feel like there are ways you should make sure it does stay faithful. Now, true stories. Let me talk about true stories. Well, true stories, I think everyone agrees, deserve to be faithful. Otherwise, you'll just feel like a total mess. You could get a story that knows how to remember what its main idea was originally in its old days, like Schindler's List, or you can get a movie that changes the idea, makes it more silly and cartoonish, like Pocahontas. That's kind of the thing, you know. You gotta really stay faithful because otherwise you feel offended. You feel offensive for doing such thing. So that part I don't think I can explain much. We can all agree on that, right? I'm sure we can. Another thing I want to bring up that kind of fits into the idea of adapting such is how it fits in with the franchise. A franchise, a media franchise, works in as, you know, a series of movies or any other sort of media out there. Like Star Wars, for example. Everyone knows Star Wars. Star Wars expands not just from movies, of course, but with shows, video games, books, all sorts of stuff. Lego Star Wars sets, all the quadrillion I own. Now, truth be told, I don't know if I explained this before or not. I probably should keep more track of what I say, but I think that a movie franchise, in terms of like a franchise of movies, really only matches when you got sequels, but when you got remakes, they only really fit in with the franchise if they're made by the same studio. That's kind of what I think, you know. The only way it will fit with the franchise is if the remake is just made by the same studio who made or currently owns the original. Or also, like I said, the only time a remake feels necessary is if it's a adaptation made by another studio, or it's because the last film of the franchise was just not good. That's just a random thing I wanted to bring up. You know, it's something I want to talk about, and I never felt a good time to talk about it, but there you go. What was I saying? Media franchises, right. How do they all fit? How do they all correlate? Considering that the Star Wars movies and video games don't all can be run by one studio, do they still match? They do. Personally, because I think that I kind of, since I seem to feel too focused on studio ownership of movies and how that would work, connecting them together in the franchise, I think in terms of like other media, they kind of should share that, have the same idea in their own little media. Like, for example, Star Wars shows, same idea with movies, a remake, it would have to be run by the same studio in order for it to count the franchise. So that franchise, that TV franchise, would connect with the movie franchise, since that they're both in part of the same idea. Or with, of course, video games, you know, they're just kind of separated in terms of what fit in the franchise, and after you have them all figured out, they can all work in as one big franchise. I don't know how I can explain it anymore. This is just something I wanted to bring up. But I don't know. I just figured that's a fun thing to mention. I don't know if it has much to do with what I was saying, but let me just go ahead and conclude this video. Adaptations, I personally think, will be fine. I personally think the only time it's perfectly fine to be unfaithful to your source material and just do things that are completely different from what it's based on is if you're just basing it off a book or something that's physical and kind of have some sort of old kind of feel to it. Something that's something physical. If it's something that's on TV, something digital, then you do have to try to stay faithful. But that's just my opinion. I'm not saying this as this is how everyone should feel. We all can be fine. Some people would say that you should stay faithful to the books. Others would say shouldn't have to stay too faithful to anything. But I personally think digital franchises and physical franchises both kind of have their separations, with one of those being an adaptation for it in what world. So, a movie will adapt perfectly fine. I'm revising, aren't I? Let me just say what I already said. A movie based on a book or a toy or anything physical is allowed to do whatever and not care too much about what it's based on. But if you're based on a video game or a show, you should care about making a good story while also caring about the source material, whether it's fixing problems or being as closely simple as is. So that's just my idea. Thought I'd share it. Good? Okay.